Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod and the first installment of a very exciting new feature. We are going full Russia on you. This is something that some of you have lobbied for. Actually, I should probably caveat that, shouldn't I, in the current environment? Full Russia, but in a non-sinister sense. There's none of the sort of current political environment within Russia permeating this podcast. And let me just be clear that this is in no way sponsored by any Russian oligarch, in case you were wondering. I'm sure you weren't. But some of you have been requesting this for a heck of a long time, a kind of deep dive into various aspects of Russian history. Who better to take us on that journey than the mighty, the incomparable? I'm being slightly facetious because my guest did say that they don't like long introductions, but the spectacular Alexander Mikaberidze is in the house, a man who frankly barely needs an introduction. If you
Wow.
haven't bought Kutuzov, A Life of
Wow.
War and Peace, go buy it. If you haven't bought The Napoleonic Wars of Global History, your bookshelf is judging you for your lack of kind of discerning taste on Napoleonic publications. I think I probably embarrassed him enough. Alex, great to see you again. How are you doing?
Wow. Wow. Didn't we talk about this? No long introductions. And especially overly kind. Thank you for having me back.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Kutuzov was one of the most popular episodes we'd had in a heck of a long time on the show, so it was a given. I'm just sorry it's taken us so long, or taken me so long, let's be honest, to sit down and make this happen. But we're going to do a lot of these, probably one a month, folks. So buckle up because it's going to be a heck of a ride. We're not going to do this sequentially, though. We are going to jump around in terms of lots of different interesting topics. And today we are doing the Battle of Berezina, a battle that barely needs an introduction in and of itself, quite frankly. It's one of the most famous. It's widely seen as hugely significant for reasons that we will look at in due course. It's also a battle that I am utterly ignorant about, other than, like, obviously I've got the basics, I get it. So prepare for the host to ask some pretty dumb questions and Alex to be very gracious in terms of how he gently tells me that I'm being an idiot. Let's start with context then. We're in the latter part of the 1812 Russian campaign, and I'm going to ask one of those really, really unpleasant podcast host questions. So without kind of giving a detailed rundown of the whole campaign, because we'll do that in other episodes, what's happened in the weeks leading up to this?
A lot. The short answer will be a lot, and that changed the very nature of the campaign. We know that Napoleon crossed the Niemen River that marked the boundary of the Russian Empire in June of 1812. We know that within the first 2 months, he fails to fulfill his operational plan and defeat the Russian armies in the borderlands. Russians were able to impose on him their own kind of operational plan, which was of a protracted war, a war that would lure, in many respects, the French forces deep into Russia and inflict strategic attrition on the enemy, will sap its resources, target its supply and logistical lines. And even though Napoleon captures Moscow in September, we know that he's nowhere near ending this war, and his diplomatic overtures to Russia are rebuffed. And so here he is, kind of stuck in Moscow for 35 days until the surprising news of the defeat of his advance guard, led by Marshal Murat, kind of shocks him back into action and prompts him to announce what I prefer to refer to as a strategic withdrawal, but I know most people will refer to it as a retreat. But I think the distinction I'm making is that Napoleon's initial intention is not of that kind of full-blown retreat, but rather redeployment, readjustment in the position with intention to fight on in the spring. But that changes in October when Kutuzov successfully bars Napoleon's advance in the south. into the southern provinces that have not been yet affected by the war. Coincidentally, this would be the provinces that would be in eastern Ukraine, the breadbaskets. And with that goal kind of no longer feasible, Napoleon is forced to retreat to the original path. Now, there is one important element in the story of Berezina, is that even though Berezina itself the battle itself takes place in November, its origins, kind of the seeds of the operation, actually are planted in September. And they are planted right in the wake of that famous battle, probably one of the most famous battles of the Napoleonic War, certainly one of the bloodiest, the Battle of Borodino, or La Moscova, as the French referred to it. And the reason for it is that even though we now today most of us accept that it's a French tactical success, and we can even go as far as to say French victory, Kutuzov, the shrewd propagandist that he was, right away, almost as soon as the battle was over, began laying the grounds for this perception that Russians didn't lose the battle, that at worst it was a stalemate, at best we actually won it. And so his original set of letters that he sends to St. Petersburg to inform the Tsar are actual letters that proclaimed victory. And so that then kind of encourages the Tsar, Alexander, and his advisors to attempt something new, something unique. And that attempt then leads to an operational plan that later on will be known as a St. Petersburg Plan. And the plan is to use the converging movements of three Russian armies. Kutuzov's main army pushing the Napoleon from the east, Admiral Pavel Chichagov's army of the Danube that just ended the war against the Turks and is marching from the south north, will be kind of converging from the south west. And then at the top, in the northern theater of the war, we have Peter Wittgenstein's independent corps that will be also converging. And so the converging movement of the three forces under this plan should have trapped Napoleon.
I think you paint really nicely there that this is a dynamic situation, right? It's an ongoing thing. And I think that sort of characterization of the retreat from Moscow is very much a sort of hindsight perception. We know how it ends, so we call the whole thing a retreat and bundle it up in a nice little bow. But as you say, that's not the plan. The plan is head south. So I think you've made that point really neatly. I'm curious about the state of the French army at this point in time. Moscow having been burnt, so cannot really hold together as a base to stay over winter. Certainly that's the common perception. Perhaps that's incorrect. But what has struck me when I've read about the campaign is that the supply issues are there almost the second they cross into Russia. They go into the borderlands and they're struggling. The weather conditions are awful during the summer. That classic thing. It's not just about the winter. Actually, the bulk of the attrition comes in the summer months. The men are dying in droves. Where does the will to fight keep coming from? Where does the cohesion come from? Is this sort of it's do or die?
And I think you're touching on very important top points here. To start with, I think the weather issue, kind of the broad theme here, is that we mostly think of 1812 in sense of cold and frost and people starving and kind of freezing to death by the side of the road. But you're right that July and August were unusually hot. In fact, the first week of the invasion in late, kind of the last few days of June, has this freak storm that hits Vilna, present-day Vilnius area. And there is this unusual, great, big difference between the night and the day temperature. The storm actually causes havoc among the cavalry as it spooks the horses and some stampede. So there are issues with that. Another, I think, issue that we can kind of touch upon is that whenever you have armies of that scale, right, and this is a colossal scale, really moving, it's inevitable that diseases will come, and you'll see the outbreak of epidemic, even if it's on a kind of local of local nature. And certainly typhus wreaks havoc on the French army in the summer. Logistics, I think, is one of the unheralded kind of stepchild of military history, even though I know that many historians in recent years have tried to bring it from the oblivion. But I think there is much to be done in terms of logistical history of Napoleonic wars, and especially of the campaigns like this, because on one hand, Napoleon has done unprecedented preparations for this campaign. So this notion that he went unprepared into Russia is bogus. I would encourage any listener to look at Margeron's massive volumes covering 1810, 1812 period, 2 years of preparations, to see the scale, truly continental scale of preparations. I think what Napoleon truly underestimated was the lack of infrastructure in Russia in many respects, kind of perennial theme. One of the discoveries personal discoveries for myself was when I went to the National Archives in France and went through the correspondence between the individual marshals and generals. And you discover how much in the first 2-3 weeks, how much they complain about lack of roads, how much they'd even complain about such basic things as lack of usable maps. So the Davout, for example, 2 days into the campaign, Davout is writing to Berthier that the maps that they have are completely useless, that they don't show the roads, they don't show the settlements that they need. And ultimately, Berthier simply tells him, listen, just draw the maps as you go. So that kind of affects the operations. So when we talk about the will to fight, that's a very interesting and kind of nebulous topic. Because one way we can look at it is through, of course, the letters and diaries and memoirs. And of course, each of them have their own drawback. But I think it will be safe to say that mostly it's about, and it's a constant theme, I think, in time of war. It's mostly about the camaraderie within unit, right? The unit cohesion, men standing and fighting for the fellow brothers in arms. There is a lot of grumbling against the emperor, right? Especially by the time they get to Smolensk and beyond, when the battles are bloody and yet don't produce the breakthrough. You hear, you see that in letters and contemporary writings, that soldiers did voice their grumblings, especially on the eve of Borodino. I think there's the famous proclamation that Napoleon issues, and the memoirs, or kind of the memoirs written, writing later on, they all kind of talk about, oh yeah, we were cheering. But if you get closer to the events and read the letters or memoirs written shortly after the war, they all talk about a very cool reception to it, because they understand what's about to happen. So I think the unit cohesion is a very crucial element here. And for the most part, I think especially French units do maintain that cohesion. The discipline issues are mostly affecting the units that really either newly created, either have greater share of recruits, or are from the non-French units that really have no beef in this contention, right? I cannot but always feel bad for the Portuguese or the Spanish or this Croats or any of the German units who are pressed to participate in this campaign. If I'm a Portuguese, what the hell am I doing in the middle of Russia in the summer or winter of 1812? You cannot but ask questions, of course. But the fact that the most units maintain their cohesion until the colossal losses of Borodino and then the retreat is a testament how much these men are willing to fight and die for the fellow soldier.
Just to turn the question sort of around and look at the other side of the same coin, the Russian troops are experiencing the same pressures, right? They're marching through the same country. They've got their own issues in terms of finite resources. they're facing the same weather conditions. How kind of well is the Russian army coping with this campaign and managing to sort of field enough men to stay in the fight?
I think they're coping better, partly because this is their land, or at least they certainly in their narratives they believe this is land. I do want to point out that much of the territory that is taken over by the French in the first month of the war was actually old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And in fact, under the Russian operational thinking, they were fine with giving up what they were called, referring to these newly acquired territories and retreat to the borders of Smolensk, where what in their mind, in this contemporary mind, was the ancient Russian lands. But the Russian army is able so there is wonderful kind of studies that been done on this, on kind of Russian preparations for the war in 1810, 1811, and there were massive supply depots established in the borderlands because there was anticipation, at least in 1811, that Russia might fight a preemptive war against Napoleon with the support of Austria and Prussia, and so they gathered actually supplies close to the border. Well, that kind of proved to be a detrimental decision because once Napoleon forces Austria and Prussia to sign alliances with him in early 1812, it becomes clear that Russia is in no position to fight a preemptive war and that the war will be fought in the Russian territory. So in the first 3 weeks of the war, Russians are desperately evacuating the supplies or burning them down so that the French don't get it. And of course, the fact that they're fighting on what they consider their soil is actually both rallying their spirits, but there is this a powerful spirit of national resistance, if you want to put it that way, that rallies the army. But there is also a side, another side to this coin, and that is that the prolonged retreat also pisses soldiers off. Right? There's this sense of, why are we retreating? This is our land. We're supposed to be standing and fighting. And here we are giving inches and miles and hundreds of miles of territory with nothing to show for it. And I think ultimately, right, we know that this is this leads to the removal of the commander-in-chief of the largest Russian army, the First Western Army, the commander, General Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, who ultimately is proven right. That's the operational plan that even though we don't have an actual copy of the plan, but we see his thinking, and that thinking is what I think helps the Russians win. But it's very unpopular. And so if we're talking about the discipline and the spirit, it actually is inflamed more by the fact that they're retreating rather than by the lack of any supplies. But there are numerous cases of ill discipline in Russian army. In fact, when Kutuzov takes over in August, his first task is to restore order, and in the first week of his command, he actually captures over 2,000 soldiers who were involved in pillaging and ransacking neighboring settlements. So that does exist, and I think that is an inherent part of any war. What Kutuzov ultimately manages to do, and what really saves the Russian army, is two factors. One is that Kutuzov is willing to sacrifice the capital, and that's, to me, is one of the most important decisions on strategic level, operational level, of the entire Napoleonic period. And because that stops Napoleon, keeps him kind of bottled up in Moscow, which gives then Kutuzov's ability to do something else, and that is to establish a camp and rebuild the Russian army in that camp over the period of about 35 days. And so that Tarutino camp is where supplies are delivered, where artillery is replenished, where cavalry is rebuilt almost from scratch. The fact that Russians receive over 24 regiments of irregular cavalry will wreak havoc on the French in the next few months. And so that's where I think war was, or at least this campaign was really won.
So November 1812, we get to Berezina. Except that what happens at Berezina really isn't the original plan, is it? Napoleon I mean, to give people an indication of just how not on the cards this idea of we're going to build a bridge was, Napoleon had ordered for the building equipment to be destroyed, but as I understand it, was disobeyed by General Eble. So why do we have this situation where it suddenly becomes necessary to cross in this manner?
That's a great question. This is kind of maybe I'll ask you to put, it's one of those rare occasions when you have the chance to play Napoleon. Maybe I can throw kind of the question back at you and ask you why, if you are Napoleon, why would you burn the bridging equipment in the middle of the
Speed.
winter?
Speed. Well, speed.
You do need forces.
Yeah.
Yeah. But here's the thing. We oftentimes focus on kind of on the winter, right? In this case, Napoleon is banking on two things. And I'm setting aside kind of the need for horses and as you said, the burden that all carrying this equipment poses. The winter was supposed to be cold. At least Caulaincourt was warning him. And by November, it's not that cold. It's cold, but it's not Russian cold, right? So Napoleon famously teases Caulaincourt, telling him, "Oh, this is your infamous, winter, Monsieur Caulaincourt." And so what he thinks is that he will have the access to the bridge at Borisov, right? There is indeed a massive bridge there, and that he will be able to cross. He also anticipates that if Caulaincourt is right, and the winter in this sets in by late November, that they will simply be able to cross the river by ice. And what happens is unusual thaw. This is once again one of those phenomenons, right? Unusual thaw in late November, when it's supposed to be everything freezing and miserable. A thaw sets in that melts the ice on the river. So by the time Napoleon gets to Borisov, a Russian army, which is Chichagov's army, already has captured the positions there and destroyed the bridge, and B, the river is flowing, so it's broken. The ice has broken because of the warmer than usual temperature. You're right that Eble discarded pontoons, right? He discarded pontoons and most of the bridging equipment, but he did something unique, and that is he told his men to save 2 filled forges, 2 wagons of charcoal, 6 wagons of implements, and then he told his men, his engineers, and to carry tools, clamps, nails, stuff them in the pockets, and carry those tools as they move, as they walked. Which meant that when they reached the shores of Berezina, there was a basic but still important set of tools that these men had to construct something. Without those forges, without that charcoal, without those tools, you cannot but wonder what would have happened on the shores of Berezina. So in that sense, Eble's decision to save those implements saved the army. But once the bridging began, we forget that Eble could not have been everywhere, right? And we know that the French were building 2 bridges. And Eble was in charge of one of those bridges. And interestingly, later on, the men who were building the second bridge were complaining that Eble got all the lion's share of credit for everything when they were there too. And they were building those damn bridges. Of course, Eble dies as this hero figure, right? The man who saves the army. And unfortunately, he dies shortly after the crossing. So, and that I think only creates the vision of him as the heroic figure. But for contemporary officers, the engineer officers, Eble was actually, in many respects, a figure who took the limelight from them. And so there are kind of memoirs that complain about the extent to which he was lionized at the expense of everyone else.
It is quite a remarkable feat of discipline to make soldiers continue to carry heavy stuff in the midst of a retreat, when we all know that soldiers have that inclination to just ditch anything that's not particularly useful at the best of times. The pack is meant to contain certain things and quite often doesn't a few weeks into a campaign because soldiers are innovative in finding workarounds and so on. So that in itself is quite remarkable. In terms of this disobeying of orders, does Eble ever kind of get sanctioned for that by anyone, or is the significance
Well,
of
this
his
is the thing.
disobedience?
He complied with the spirit of the order. Napoleon said, "Cast aside pontoons." He cast aside pontoons. He didn't mention about the hammers and nails or forges.
Inventive interpretation of orders.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
what I really find, and I think goes to the point that you were making, Zach, and that is to convince men to follow the orders, not just in terms of carrying this stuff, right? But especially when you get to the river. And there are, listeners can Google the pictures of Berezina, and you can see that it's not necessarily a wide river in terms of its flow. As Marceline Marbeau, the famous memoirist, points out, that the main flow of the river was as wide as one of the Parisian streets, but it's the whole valley kind of in which it flows that is marshy, that the river is broken up in multiple kind of channels, that requires construction of a large or at least long bridge that will cover both the river itself, but also the marshy banks. So that's one issue. The second issue is that the river itself is not that deep, but it's damn November. I'm a scout leader, and I take my scouts out on camping. And last fall, I took them out. I think it was late October. I took them out in the mountains of Arkansas, and I was like, "Let's go swim." And everyone was like, are you insane?" But I set the example, and I jumped into the river and immediately regretted it. I cannot imagine being in November in the ice-covered river, even if it's flowing for more than 30 seconds. And yet, here you are, Eble, Chasseloup, or I have to kind of mention the non-French engineers who contributed decisively to the success of this operation. Men like Dutch engineer captain George Diederich Benthian, who was in charge of the Dutch group of engineers and who encouraged his men to go time and again into these frozen waters and to stand there for minutes, holding up the trestles, making sure that everything is sturdy, and ultimately dying. Right? That's where it really is stunning to me. And I think one of the most powerful moments in what Captain Rigaud, French Captain Rigaud, says superhuman effort. One of the most powerful moments was when Maciej Rybinski is the Polish officer from the 15th Polish line. So he's crossing this bridge, and he sees Polish pontooniers. So along the French, there were Dutch and the Polish pontooniers building this. And so this Polish man, he sees them, as he describes, half immersed in the water, some up to their neck, standing with his eyes kind of hammering them, bloodied, freezing, holding up this bridge by this sheer determination. And he stops and kind of turns to an officer and kind of asks them in Polish, like, why they do that. And they respond to him, and I get just chills kind of thinking about this sacrifice that this officer tells that my men are devoted to this mission. And they said, we might die today, but the army will pass through. And that is something absolutely unique. Right? To be a Pole and to be here on the shores of this river, dying in the middle of the ice flow with the idea that you will save somebody else's life.
It's the knowledge of the death sentence that this represents, isn't it? You know, they go into that river knowing full well what's going to. These people aren't idiots. They they've watched the campaign unfold. They've seen plenty of their colleagues die from cold exposure. They know what happens when you go into a river and you get wet, and then you've got to come out, and it's minus whatever it is degrees Celsius, and yet there's that willingness to just keep on doing it. And as you say, to find the strength that in ordinary circumstances you wouldn't expect a human to be able to find. It's remarkable. It really is. Although I do agree with.
Yeah, Benthian has about roughly 200 engineers under his command. When they start building this bridge, by the end of this operation, there will be only 40 surviving. So the attrition rate death rate is stunning. And Captain Henry or Heinrich von Brandt has wonderful memoirs. He served in the 2nd Regiment of the Vistula, and he has this admiration for the sacrifice that these Dutch, Polish, and French mountaineers have done here, and he calls it the most sublime achievement of the war, perhaps of any war. And I think that's a very appropriate assessment of what these men have accomplished.
And we'll talk in due course about the significance of their sacrifice, because this moment is huge. But we'll save that conversation for a bit further down the line. I just want to talk first about those 4 days, because it takes time to build a bridge. You know, you don't manufacture it overnight. And sure, initially the French seem to have outwitted the Russians, but there's a whole kind of almost a mini campaign in its own right that is going on around this need to buy the time to get the men across. So talk us through that and how it unfolds.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and in fact, that's one of the kind of my pet peeves in writing my own kind of histories of the Berezina campaign. When I kind of began my studies, the prevailing story was of Napoleonic brilliance, and Napoleon single-handedly outmaneuvers, outsmarts the Russians and saves the army. But as in every history, once you scratch the surface, you discover the complexities and the myths that need to be kind of revealed. And then Berezina is a good example of it. So by the time Napoleon arrives on the shores of Berezina, there is already attempt to construct the bridge. At least the trestles already are being constructed. But the problem was that the trestles were not built of kind of strong enough wood or timber. And so when Ablé and his colleague Chasseloup look at these trestles, they realize they have to start from scratch. So they need extra time. And so that time is gained not necessarily by the French, but it's given to them by the Russians. It is true in this traditional sense of narrative that the French tried to attempt a diversion south of Berezina. So Oudinot famously began constructing a crossing, or at least pretending to construct a crossing at a small village south of actual crossing. And what he particularly did, and that's something really interesting, is that he spread rumors, kind of gathered the locals and kind of interviewed them about the potential good crossing sites, and then made sure that they overheard their conversations that they are intending to cross the river there, south of Berezina, or south of Borisov. And those locals then ran over to the Russian army on the western side of the river, to the army commanded by Chichagov, and spread the stories that, hey, the French are trying to cross south. That in itself would not have been decisive, right? Yes, Russian officers do complain about these rumors affecting the operations, but that piece of intelligence would not have been decisive if it was not part of a larger mosaic that Chichagov had to assemble in this fog of war that surrounded him. And here, as I point out in my book, here the dynamics of within the Russian army play a decisive role. Chichagov is an interesting gentleman. He's not a career army officer. He is actually an admiral. So appointing him to command an army itself, kind of raised quite a few eyebrows, because as a Swedish officer remarked kind of sarcastically, right? Why would you entrust an army to a naval commander? And he called it a strange idea. It was a strange idea. But Chichagov has, until 1812, he has an interesting kind of career. So he started by graduating from a naval corps. He distinguished himself fighting the Swedes in the Baltic, again, part of the naval career. He survived the Pauline purges of late 1790s, was actually good enough to be promoted by Paul to rear admiral, and then subsequently had an interesting relationship with the Tsar Alexander, who made him vice admiral and the minister of navy. And I think what made him a galvanizing kind of figure was the fact that he was an honest and forthright man. He expressed his opinions directly, I would even say bluntly, and the fact that he spent some time kind of overseas, the fact that later on he will spend much of his life in exile, certainly overshadows that. But I think many Russians found him full of pretentiousness. And what they meant by that is that Chichagov looked down on what he perceived was Russian backwardness, and that he wanted to bring substantive reforms, substantive changes. And that was not necessarily a popular thing. In fact, his willingness to attempt change earned him this reputation of being a quote unquote Jacobin, right, which was a nasty word at the time. And so, but Emperor Alexander appreciated him for that forthrightness, for his willingness to kind of be accountable and expect accountability from others. And so he gave him this army command. But I think ultimately it's a mistake, because Chichagov doesn't have the experience necessary to command an army. I'm not even talking about the division in the army. From the perception of the men like Kutuzov or Wittgenstein, this is an outsider, as his contemporaries derisively called him landlubber general. Right? Who the hell is he, right? A naval guy in charge of an army, just because he's good friends with the Tsar. And so the relationship between him and other commanders are quite tense, and especially between him and Kutuzov, because just a few months earlier, now remember, we are in November, but if we go back to spring of 1812, Kutuzov was commanding the army, the Russian army tasked with defeating the Ottoman Empire. And he came very close to do that. He crushed their main Ottoman army at Russe. He captured, in its remarkable operation, captured most of the Ottoman army, and then was pushing hard to impose the peace on the Ottomans. Now, his hands, however, were tied by these really unreasonable demands that Emperor was making until spring of 1812, when Alexander finally listened to Kutuzov and mellows down and kind of reduces his demands. But by then, Kutuzov is pissed off, Alexander is pissed off, and in this relationship, Alexander decides to send Chichagov to replace Kutuzov as the commander-in-chief of the army and as the guy who will sign the peace. And so Kutuzov is then even, kind of infuriated by this, because he spent almost 6 months negotiating this peace for this upstart landlubber general to show up and steal his thunder. So what he does is he cuts a deal with the Ottomans literally hours before Chichagov arrives. So he signs the peace, and then Chichagov shows up the next morning. So everyone is pissed off. So that all takes place in May. in May. And now in November, they expect these guys to kind of shake hands and say, yep, let's do it together. Now let's add a third gear here, and that is 43-year-old Peter Wittgenstein, a son of a Prussian officer who then entered Russian service. Wittgenstein was very well connected in the Russian society. His mother was a Russian princess from a very influential family. He grew up in the family of the famous Russian Field Marshal Nikolai Saltykov. He started his career in elite Life Guard regiment. He just in 1812 scores this important victory at Polotsk, which was frankly overblown in its importance, but at the time Wittgenstein was hailed as the savior of St. Petersburg because he stopped allegedly this French push towards St. Petersburg. We know they didn't intend to do it, but nonetheless, he sold that narrative. And so now Wittgenstein is supposed to come under the command of the Landwehr general if he gets too close to Chichagov's forces. And so what you see, therefore, is when this Russian army starts slowly converging on the shores of Berezina, Kutuzov is not particularly keen on wasting the lives of his men to achieve what he already sees being accomplished, and that is destruction of the French army. He sees the winter, the cold, the starvation will kill the French as, without the Russian involvement, so why endanger the Russian lives? Chichagov is very keen to kind of stop Napoleon, but he doesn't know that Kutuzov is falling behind. And then we have Wittgenstein, who is not particularly excited about coming in the command of Chichagov, so he delays his pressure from the north, comes out with the lame excuses like the roads were impassable, and arrives to the shores about 2 days late. And so ultimately, therefore, what we have is Chichagov alone facing Napoleon's army. Now, let's make the story a bit more complicated. And this is where the Clausewitzian fog of war comes into play. These three armies, Wittgenstein, Chichagov, and Kutuzov, are separated by hundreds of miles. The communications are really poor, especially in the conditions of lack of roads, cold. And so what they share is information that sometimes is outdated, sometimes is not complete, most of the time is not complete. And so it allows both Wittgenstein and Kutuzov and Chichagov to kind of extrapolate or assume what probably is happening. So in mid-November, Kutuzov sends a series of letters to Chichagov. Wittgenstein sends a series of letters to Chichagov, where, based on partial intelligence, they assume that Napoleon might be heading south. So south of Borisov, because it would have been advantageous for Napoleon. Southern provinces were unaffected, so there would have been a lot of supplies there, and we know they did. Minsk has massive supply depot that Chichagov would capture in late November. There is Austrian corps, Schwarzenberg's corps is there. And of course, he will be getting towards the kind of this Polish, Lithuanian, kind of provinces where the local populace might have been more willing to support the French army. And so when Chichagov receives these letters from Kutuzov and then Wittgenstein, it seems to him that these two experienced career officers must have some information that Chichagov doesn't have. And so that piece, to me, is decisive. The letters that point him to the south. Then he receives the news from the locals that French are doing something in that small village south of Borisov. And for Chichagov, it creates a mosaic, from these bits and pieces. But the image that is emerging is that of French trying to cross the river south of Borisov. And so on November 25, Chichagov makes the remarkable decision to leave just a small detachment around Borisov and then take his entire army south. And I cannot but wonder what it was like when you're standing as a French or Polish or German or any of one of those soldiers on the other side of the bank, and you see this army as if magically, right? Clear the shore and move south when you know that you're going to be crossing north. What an exciting moment.
I mean, everything you say, it's quite unfortunate, isn't it? You know, it looks like the right call, but it's all for the wrong reasons, right? And as you explain it very well, as you would, that there's a lot of logic, there's a lot of information that coalesces to create an impression that just happens to be the wrong impression. It's quite remarkable, really, and of course, it's one of the big what ifs of the period, right? There's a lot of prisoners.
There is a guy up, Zach. There is a guy up north, Major General Chaplitz, who has a detachment. His task is to observe the northern flank of Chichagov's army, and Chaplitz is literally looking down on the river where Chasseloup, Eble, and others are building trestles. And he sends messages to Chichagov saying, I think this is where they're going to be crossing. And Chichagov kind of tells him, shut the hell up. We have all the evidence that this is a diversion that you're looking at, and the actual crossing will be south. And so when he takes this army and moves it on 25th of November, Chaplitz is pissed off. I mean, he's convinced. And so he tries to delay his departure until he gets a letter threatening him with a court-martial unless he complied with the original order to fall back at once. And so can you imagine how frustrating it is for this guy, for Chaplitz, to kind of see the truth right there?
You can just imagine the frustration. I'm looking at them, for heaven's sake. You know, it's one of the, if they had radio communications, it would be like that scene in The Longest Day. So apologies, folks who aren't World War One fans, but very famous film. There's a point at which one of the forward commanders in the German army goes down to the beaches and is looking at through his binoculars, and then suddenly sees the Allied flotilla arriving. He's going, 4,000 ships, and the guy on the other end of the phone goes, "Mein lieber Bruskat, where do you think these allies are going with these 4,000 ships?" He goes, "They're coming right at me, for heaven's sake!"
That's exactly that's Chaplin's right there. On November 25. That's right.
It's remarkable. It genuinely is. It doesn't all go swimmingly, does it? You get a lot of prisoners getting taken. Most famously, of course, the 8,000 men of 12th Division are taken prisoner, but also huge numbers of stragglers. What happens to these people when they're taken prisoner? What kind of reception do they get, given the campaign that's just unfolded?
So I think we have to distinguish maybe the types of prisoners, because as we all know, the French army was accompanied by a massive force of stragglers. So the stragglers would have been already kind of considered non-combatants, and they would have been in dire straits. In fact, one of the kind of tragedies of Berezina is the fact that when the crossing began on 26, so the whole day they were crossing, then through the night, by the time we get to the second day, late in the evenings, bridges are actually open, especially during the night of 28th November. The bridges is completely open, and what you see is the sense of complacency that sets in among the stragglers that, well, the bridges are there, the army is moving across, the enemy seems to be kind of somewhere in the south, and many of these people who could have crossed the bridge delayed the crossing for a day. And that creates then that infamous stampede when the battle really escalates. And so many of the people could have survived. But the stragglers would have absolutely a horrifying experience here, both by sleeping out in the open, because the village, the local villages like Studenka and Brili and others will be completely dismantled by the troops, both in order to build the bridges, they need the timber, but also in terms of firewood. So there's little shelter that they have, so they have to sleep outside, and many of them do die of exposure. And yes, when they are captured by the kind of end of the operation, they are mistreated. We do know that the mistreatment is usually in the first few hours of the captivity, right? Once before this order or some sense of order is restored. And they were, especially by the Cossacks, they were robbed clean and abused. There was one, very interesting details you can glean from different memoirs, including, I think, one German officer who kind of stands there and cries when when the Cossacks come and rob him clean and take his horse and all these possessions. But he understands that there is not much he can really do about it, because any sign of resistance would have been punishable with severity. But once the order is established, the prisoners would be organized in batches and then shipped for processing at the prisoner of war sites, and they will be scattered across the Russian Empire. And I've written an article kind of analyzing what happens to many of these prisoners. And we know that during the campaign, especially in the second half of it, when mass majority of prisoners are captured, but we estimate that at least 150,000 prisoners were actually taken. So we're not counting those who were, let's say, killed, but this 150,000 were processed. And about a third of them, more than a third actually, dies during those winter months. So from December of 1812 to April of 1813. And they died during transportation, when they arrive at the location, when so oftentimes they were the infrastructure was not yet ready. So though the most vulnerable die there, but those who survive, they actually have a decent experience in over the next year or so. The Russian government actually sets aside money at least to cover the expenses of maintaining them. And yes, as it often happens, money was kind of abused, misspent, and corruption consumed part of it. But I think the Russians tried as best as they could in the conditions that we're in. Remember, they just went through a devastating war. They still are fighting the war, and now they also have to take care of the tens of thousands of these prisoners of war. But they will be releasing them in groups or throughout 1814. The French and the Polish prisoners will be the last one to release. And then, of course, there is a wonderful memoir literature that comes out from that experience.
I'm conscious of time, so I guess we should start talking about impacts. And I'm also curious about the title of the book that you've done for Osprey, because you call it Napoleon's Hollow Victory. So for the French, we have this perception that this is survival. This is, without this, there is possibly no Napoleon, because he perhaps gets captured, and therefore you get the end of the war. There's no army from which he can rebuild when it comes to the 1813 campaign. If not for the Berezina, there is no Napoleonic Wars. It ends there. Is that fair, or would you beg to differ?
No, I think that is absolutely fair. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons I called it a hollow victory, is that there is no, yes, you can call it a victory. And my good old friend, Fernand Beaucourt, who was an eminent historian of Berezina, he was a French historian who spent years and years trying to kind of commemorate this event and bring wider knowledge of it. He wrote a French study of the battle, and he called it a military, Berezina, a military victory. You can call it a victory, but the question will be kind of at what cost? The cost of sacrificing a larger share of the army is one. The bigger cost, the one that I focus, is, as you said, Napoleon's survival. Had Napoleon been completely dismantled here and maybe even captured, Napoleonic Wars would have ended a year and a half earlier, at the saving hundreds of thousands of lives, sparing much of Europe devastation, at least Central Europe, the devastation of it. So that this is where I, looking at this, look at, Kutuzov. I hold him responsible to a larger degree for that, because his policy of what later on will be known as the Golden Bridge, and letting Napoleon leave Russia because he already failed to accomplish what he wanted. Russia has not been defeated. In fact, Napoleon suffers a devastating blow. And Kutuzov kind of wants him to leave Russia because he has strategic thinking. He famously says that, if we completely demolish Napoleon, can destroy him completely, Europe might end up in a new cycle of political anarchy, political violence, and that will not be in the interest of Russia. So he wants some semblance of French imperial presence to survive in Europe, in modified sense, but nonetheless he wants it. But that also means, kind of Napoleon's escaping, building a new army, and coming back, and so that to me is one of the kind of awkward legacies of Berezina. I think on a different level, Berezina is a stark example of a heroism, of a human and a tragedy, because there is so many little angles that you can find in memoir literature, in diaries and journals and letters, that underscore the utter misery of what these people went through. One of the I think moments that stuck with me is the memory. I think it comes from a French memoir by the name of Bourgogne. And Bourgogne writes about a mother that he sees, a mother that is fallen in the river and is dying, and she's kind of holding up a boy, and she's asking a passerby to save the boy because she's gonna die. And the boy survives, incredibly survives, and the memoirist later notes that he's seen him later on at the end of the war, or a scene of visitors in the wake, Russian visitors in the wake of the battle, when they are confronted by an utterly kind of horrifying example of a river strewn with these bodies. I think in many respects, Berezina is the manifestation of the war, of war, both at its worst, but also at its, I don't want to say that best, but it is, in terms of human heroism, endurance, perseverance, selfless sacrifice. And that's to me, is a symbol of this battle.
Yeah, I mean, you outlined this brilliantly the whole way through this. You see the full spectrum, from the horrors through to the heroism and everything in between. I'm curious, and this is a little bit of a rabbit hole, but peace in 1812, what, and obviously this is speculative, but what do you suspect that might have looked like? Because you do get, or at least my gut is that Napoleon probably stays on the throne.
Oh yes,
yeah.
I mean, we know, for example, in 1813, the conditions that he received just 6 months later would have allowed him to survive. I think the conditions of 1812, this supposed peace treaty, would have been modified version of the offer that he received at Plaischwitz, and that is, France remains hegemonic in Western Europe. Russia has the sway in Eastern Europe, probably gobbles up the rest of Poland or the Duchy of Warsaw, and there will be the question of the future for the German states. The fact that Napoleon was not yet defeated in Central Europe, right? Leipzig hasn't occurred yet. Lets me assume that maybe Napoleon would have been able to retain still greater control of the Confederation of the Rhine. Neither Austrians or Prussians would have been, I think, strong enough to do that. But it would have still allowed, I have no doubt, for the Napoleonic Empire to endure. I mean, Napoleon had all these opportunities through the 1813 and all up to Leipzig to preserve his power, to remain not just in France, but in larger share of Western Europe. And he, time and again, he refused to do that.
As of course we've discussed on other episodes, and perhaps we'll end up touching in greater depth in other times. But there's one last question I'm going to ask you before I let you go, and I'm very much conscious of this kind of almost farcical situation that we were discussing earlier. Look, I'm looking at them, they're blatantly here, they're about to cross, and you're telling me to leave them be. Do heads roll in the Russian camp as a result of missing the opportunity here? What are the consequences for the Russians?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great one. And the answer is one head rolls. One. And that is the head of Chichagov, the outsider. Kutuzov is too unassailable. Right? He's the national hero that leads Russia to defeat or to the victory of Napoleon. So there is no question that anyone will touch him at that time. And of course, he dies in the spring of 1813. And Alexander makes a conscientious effort to elevate Kutuzov to the ranks of national heroes that you will find very few examples of. So Kutuzov is buried in the central cathedral in St. Petersburg that is turned into the military shrine, the shrine of military glory, the great Kazan Cathedral. So there is no one who will try to smear him for generations to come. Wittgenstein is too well connected. And there is an interesting memoir, I think, written by Berg, General Berg. And at one point, Berg, he says, we knew that we screwed up. And we knew that Wittgenstein is guilty, but we just didn't want to air our dirt out in the public, so we agreed not to talk about it. And they do. They actually kept it inside, so the officers all covered it up. But there has to be a scapegoat, and that scapegoat was the admiral who was condemned, who was ostracized, who was vilified. There's a remarkable series of caricatures that portray him as a crawfish. That's my favorite, since he's land lover, right? So he's a crawfish. There's a wonderful caricature of Kutuzov holding a net about to ensnare Napoleon, and this crawfish coming out and cutting a hole in it, which is completely bogus, but that's what happens when you're a national idol like Kutuzov. And Chichagov is astonished by this. He famously writes a letter in which he says, the crowd is blind. The crowd is blind. And he writes to Tsar and he says, listen, people are easily deceived and manipulated. You know the truth. Right? When are you going to come out and tell the people what really happened? And the Tsar never does. So essentially, he lets Kutuzov to be that sacrificial lamb. And so he was hounded so relentlessly that within a few months, he has to leave Russia and moves to England, where he spends the rest of his life writing memoirs, writing letters, trying to clear his name. Sadly for him, and I feel the tragedy of his life is that he had a long life. He outlived Kutuzov, he outlived Napoleon, and so he had a long time to watch his rivals, the people that he really fought and despised, elevated to the position where he could do nothing to even touch them, while he was condemned and pushed into the shadows of history.
It's a sobering thing to end on, isn't it? That whole kind of concept of who writes the history afterwards. Alex, such a joy to talk to you again. Thank you so much for your time. Folks, Berezina 1812, Napoleon's Hollow Victory was published by Osprey. You're also going to want, there's no debate about this, you will want Kutuzov, A Life in War and Peace by OUP, and The Napoleonic Wars, A Global History. I will put links in the description, and Alex will be back within a month to talk about something rather different. Folks, if you've enjoyed this show, please do me a favor. Head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a 5-star review. If you're not a regular listener, remember to hit that subscribe button so you can find your way back. All of those things are incredibly powerful in helping this show to reach a wider audience. Much love, as ever, to all my Patreon supporters. Shout outs to my mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Coulson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, David Milinski, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Merlon, and Darla Vincent. And the Admirals, John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Ned Campbell, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Mark Chestnut, and Jason Morn. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.